Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to be talking about Commander Tough Rules and Cool Interactions, episode 162. Today's episode is going to take a look at two cards that should probably be seeing a lot more play in a lot of decks out there that can really benefit from them, but a lot of players are probably not running them because, for one, they probably didn't think they legally could run them in their decks, but also because they probably didn't think about the possible synergies that they could have with these two cards. The technical rules aspect of this episode will be nice and short, but the real meat of the episode will be in the many examples that I have included here to help you out if you happen to be running any of these decks or any of these cards that go into any of these decks. So let's jump straight into it. There is a very common confusion in Commander regarding Extort, because for certain versions of cards with Extort, that contains the reminder text, and some it does not contain the reminder text. It's the ones that do contain the reminder text that kind of confuses people, and that's because it shows in that reminder text the white-black hybrid mana symbol, and so a lot of players think that they cannot use an Extort card in their deck because their commander doesn't have a white color identity or doesn't have a black color identity. But because the symbol only shows up in the reminder text and not in the actual text of the actual abilities of the cards themselves, those cards do not gain a white or black color identity. The thing I cover today is along a similar line to what I just described there. The two cards that I'm going to be focusing on today are Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. And they both do a similar effect in that they're both lands themselves, and they add the swamp or forest subtype respectively to all lands in play. Your lands, your opponent's lands, and even the lands themselves. Despite them looking like their color identity is black or green, they're not. They're actually colorless cards, and they have colorless identities, more importantly. The question then becomes, why would you even want to run these in your decks if you're not in those colors, if you don't have a black and or green deck? What benefit could you have from it? Well, I'm about to give you 20-ish examples of decks that should run them and cards that have synergies with them. So if you happen to run these cards, or if you're even just close to doing these kind of effects, you might want to run these cards as well as these two lands that synergize with them. I'll start with a personal deck of mine run by Carmen Cruel Sky Marcher. She has the triggered ability that says, whenever Carmen attacks, return up to one target permanent card with mana value less than or equal to Carmen's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. The deck is kind of based around sacrificing smaller permanents like creatures and artifacts for value and then getting them back with the commander, Carmen, and other cards that have this Sun Titan type of return effect. I also happen to sacrifice a lot of fetch lands because they become ramp when I'm able to just keep bringing them back over and over from the graveyard. This lets me run the off-color fetches as well, like Verdant Catacombs, but the problem with that deck is that sometimes I run out of those certain lands to search for. I end up searching and tutoring them all out and getting them all onto the battlefield. I have no more to actually search for. But when I have out my Yavimaya, then I don't have to worry about drawing into dead lands that don't do anything, because now I can actually tap the Verdant Catacombs for a green mana. I also run Urborg in there, but Yavimaya, I don't think I've ever seen Yavimaya show up in anybody's Carmen deck. Similarly to that, other fetch lands like Evolving Wilds, Terramorphic Expanse, and even the Capenna lands like Broker's Hideout get better with an Urborg and a Yavimaya out. Maybe you've run out of those specific basic lands to search for, or maybe you just really need that mana that it could have produced, no matter what the color, that very turn that you get the land. Normally, the basics that these lands are able to search for enter tapped, and you've got to wait a whole new turn to be able to use them. But with Yavimaya and Urborg out, you can just tap them for mana right then and there, rather than tapping and sacrificing the Evolving Wilds, or just sacking the Broker's Hideout to its triggered ability. The Broker's Hideout is especially cool. It has a triggered ability that, for when it enters, causing you to sacrifice it, and then you search for a tapped basic. But while the trigger is on the stack for you to sacrifice it and search for the land, you can actually tap it and float the mana, and then get your tapped land afterwards. If you're in a Landfall deck, this is a great way to run a lot more fetch lands in your deck to get more Landfall triggers and not slow yourself down with lands having to be entered tapped. Again, that's another thing. A lot of people don't know they can run those Capenna fetch lands even if their deck doesn't care about that actual land type. It's just more Landfall triggers. In recent years, I've seen a lot of Legendary Matters decks, and one of those commanders, one of the more popular ones that I see a lot, is Shanid Sleeper's Scourge, which often does see an Urborg in the build. I actually looked at the EDH rec page for it. It only shows up 40% of the time, according to its page, which I think is way too low. But then you don't see the Yavimaya show up at all. It just not even like 1% or like 0% or anything. It just doesn't show up on the EDH rec page at all for Shanid. Getting a free card draw for just playing your land in a Mardu deck is pretty wild. So don't miss out on that if you have a Legends Matters deck, especially one that's being led by Shanid. Proliferate is a very fun theme. I actually have a few Proliferate decks of my own. So let's say you're in a non-black or a non-green Proliferate deck, and you want to run Crystalline Crawler, which lets you remove its +1/+1 counters in order to add mana of any color to your mana pool. But it has Converge, which says that it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. By running both of these lands, and if you got them both out, even if you don't have any actual force or swamps, you can get a lot more value from cards like the Crawler. This would also include things, cards that have Sunburst, like on something like Pentad Prism. You can get a lot more counters on those by just having a variety of mana. Another use for these two lands is your utility lands that get a little bit better by them being out on the battlefield. Lands with no abilities on them, like Maze of Ith, Safe Haven, and Dark Depths, can now actually be used for mana if you need them. Another great utility land that can have synergy with these lands is Field of the Dead. If you're in a mono black or a mono green deck and you run Field of the Dead, it can sometimes be a little risky to run too many non-forest or non-swamp basics, because once you start adding so many colorless utility lands, you might not always be drawing into your color-producing lands consistently enough. But these two lands can help with that, even if you're not running something like Cabal Coffers to combo with the Urborg. That still gives you a lot of land name diversity in order to help trigger your field. Some decks involve you casting spells from other players, but those kinds of effects letting you do that don't always let you spend mana as though it were any color. Something like with Sin Triplets here. So if you can get these two lands out, then it can help you to cast the green and black spells that you're stealing from your opponents. If you're playing in a particularly higher power pod, maybe you're at an LGS that just happens to run a lot of Stax-y kind of cards, not something that super stacks like Stasis, but sometimes you might come across the card Void Mirror from time to time. Honestly, it's just a great card to try to shut off cheating of spells through methods like Cascade and things like that, but it can also just utterly shut down a colorless deck. So if you have a colorless deck, then you can start running these two cards, these two lands, in your colorless artifact deck or your colorless Eldrazi deck, and it'll do some good work to help keep you from being locked out of the game. Again, if Void Mirror shows up oftentimes in your pods or at your LGS. I've seen people build decks with Shanna Sisay's Legacy, and they're oftentimes going to be based around her being a super cheap commander that's easy to recast from the command zone, even with the command tax, because she starts out at only costing 2 mana. But she gets bigger with the more creatures that you have out, and players use cards that let you sacrifice her for value based upon her power, or you can just cast spells that care about your biggest creature. You draw equal to the biggest power that you control and things like that. There is a creature I've never seen talked about in decks like that just want a singular, really big creature, and that card is Angry Mob from the Dark. It's an old card. There's been several printings. It's actually a pretty cheap card for being something from 1994. And it says that during your turn, its power and toughness are each equal to 2 plus the number of swamps your opponents control. Now, in a normal game of 4-player Commander, that number can actually be pretty big, making this 4 mana value creature much larger than just 4 power. But if you throw in an Urborg, then you can make that Angry Mob massive, as its power will likely be equal to 2 plus every land that your opponents control. So on turn 6 or 7, if your opponents haven't missed any land drops, it'll be a 23-23 or something along those lines. That's assuming they haven't even ramped out lands all that much. A 4 mana 20-something creature, that's nothing to scoff at. Now, if you're in a life gain deck, then you can normally run Roots of Life to gain a lot of life in just a normal game of Commander. Again, blue and black decks are going to be pretty common in Commander. But you can ensure that it'll gain you dozens of instances of life gain every turn of the table when you play your Urborg with it. Importantly, it does say target opponent on the card printed, as it was only ever printed back in Mirage. However, the Oracle text of it does make it so that it triggers from each of your opponents. Even in a non-life gain focused deck, this card can be bonkers, gaining you 20 to 30 life every turn of the table once you're passed around like turn 5 or 6 or so in the game, just because of how many lands your opponents are going to be tapping. I have a Baba Lysaga Night Witch deck that likes to repeatedly sacrifice the card Spreading Algae because it keeps coming back to me every time I sacrifice it. But if you happen to run Spreading Algae as a form of fair land hate, it's not too mean of a land hate, then making every single land that your opponents control a swamp in addition to its other types lets you now be able to hit every powerful utility land that they have in play. And if you're in an Enchantress deck that likes to just cast a lot of cheap enchantments, then this card, Spreading Algae, could be really handy. Every time your opponent does need to use that land, the land will be destroyed, and Spreading Algae will come back, and you can recast it, triggering all of your Enchantresses for just 1 green mana. Really cool effect. This next one, likely to not come up for a lot of players, but if you've ever wanted to build a deck with Veldraine of Sangir, he can make himself gain Forest Walk. He's pretty unique creature in that regard. Oh, I just said pretty unique. I don't like saying pretty unique. He is a unique creature in the sense that I can't find any other non-green creature in the game that has Forest Walk. So pretty cool thing. So yeah, if you play Yavimaya, then you now have a commander that is unblockable to all of your opponents. What a cool Voltron deck to build. I actually have a list for him. I've never built him, but I do have a list for him. Maybe one day I will share it here on this channel. Another niche but cool card is Stern Judge, which can tap to make each player lose 1 life for each swamp that they control. If you're in a deck with a lot of untapping effects, often found in white, green, and blue, then this can easily wipe out your opponents as long as you have built up enough life to also survive the last activation that you would need to kill all of your opponents and not kill yourself in the process. You're in white, so that shouldn't be too tough for you to build your deck around it and gain some life to get you above that threshold. I mean, if you're playing cards like Stern Judge, I also think that most players are just going to ignore you for a while because they're not going to really see you as a threat. There are quite a few cards in Magic that let you change words around on cards, so you could use cards like Magical Hack and Mind Bend, and there's also plenty of other ones. If you're in a deck with a commander that happens to have a Landwalk ability, or just a lot of creatures that have Landwalk or can be given Landwalk, now that makes it to where these spells can help make sure that all of those creatures are unblockable to all of your opponents. I know that some players out there like to make decks around the theme of you did this to yourself, or, like quit hitting yourself kind of a thing, in which their deck and the cards that they play causes them to, their opponents to die over time from their own actions. So a card like Karma can become a very short ticking time bomb that makes it so that each player has only about 1 to 2, maybe 3 turns left before their land base itself just kills them. And then finally, the classic mean combo that I just have to mention is how your Urborg and Cormus Bell makes it so that all of your opponent's lands are now 1/1 creatures, and then you can play something like an Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite to nuke all of their lands the very second that the Elesh Norn resolves, and then any future lands that they play cannot even be used for mana due to them having summoning sickness, but it doesn't matter because state-based actions will have those lands dying before they could ever even be tapped. Now, I know that it can be difficult to run these cards in decks that synergize with specific other cards in the deck that, aren't necessarily your commander, as you just might not draw into these 2 different cards that specifically synergize with each other. And then you're just sitting there with dead cards in hand. But the ones that I've covered here today, maybe not all of them, but some of them, are oftentimes just solid at any time in a 4 or more player game of Commander, like that life gain one. I just don't see how that thing doesn't gain you a ton of life. They will likely always be able to net you some value for some of the ones that I've mentioned here. But the thing is, over the last few years, WotC has made it easier for non-green decks to just search up some specific cards and specific lands with things like Expedition Map and more recently Urza's Cave, which, as I said in my lands video for 2024, is probably the most impactful land of the entire year, and probably honestly in the last few decades, because it is just going to be every land in your library. It is a land that tutors for any land straight onto the battlefield. Well, that's all I have for this maybe lengthy episode. Oh, yeah, actually, I just looked at the time. It has been a while. I know that there's a lot of other synergies out there with these 2 lands, but I had to end this video at some point. My whole body is freezing as I've turned off all my heaters. But do you guys run any of these 2 lands in your non-black and non-green decks? If so, please share down in the comments the cards that you use them with, especially if it's your commander that has a synergy with them. But if you just have some cool cards, I might list some others in the comments if I don't see anybody mentioning them, but this video has already gotten to be long enough already, so I got to end it at some point. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta.